Can you say, "This is Dr. Amanda Zelechoski"?
Why do we have to?
Just try it.
Oh, I can't.
Deep breath. Okay.
This is Dr. Amanda Zelechoski. Lindsay Malloy. Ah!
Now, wait, say Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
No, come back.
This is Dr. Lindsay Malloy. Welcome to the Parenting Podcast.
One more time.
And then after that, can we have a candy after?
No.
Please, Mommy.
Okay, ready?
Pandemic Parenting Podcast.
Excellent.
Welcome to the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. I'm Dr. Amanda Zelechoski, one of the co-founders of Pandemic Parenting. As psychologists, scholars, and moms, my colleague Dr. Lindsay Malloy and I share science-based research to help all who care for kids navigate this challenging time together. This episode is the first in a two-part series on trauma-informed parenting. I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Jen Serico about the concept of trauma, what it looks like when a child is traumatized, and how that's different than general stress, and when your child might need additional support. It was really great to get her perspective as an expert in the field of child trauma. I especially appreciated her reminders to us to focus on consistency as best we can in our homes and on taking care of ourselves, recognizing the impact of our children's stress on our own stress and vice versa. I also encourage you to check out part 2 of this series when we hear from Dr. Julian Ford on the topic of trauma as well. He shares the ABCs of being a reassuring parent and speaks specifically to the challenges parents who are medical professionals and other essential workers face during the pandemic. So make sure to check that out as well. Let's get into it. All right, so I am here with Dr. Jen Serico, who is a longtime dear friend of mine and now esteemed colleague. We know each other from graduate school many years ago. We won't say how many years ago. So I'm wondering if you can, too many, exactly. If you can tell us a little bit about, sort of your role now, a little bit about your professional background and how you became interested in trauma.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I actually became interested in trauma. I'll start there because that dates back to the work that we did together. When I was in graduate school, I did a lot of work with kids, justice involved youth. And so in that work, what I saw over and over were how many kids had been exposed to trauma or experienced significant traumatic events and had never received treatment. And that had significantly impacted the course of their development and in large part contributed to them ending up in the justice system. And so, being able to kind of think about how can I intervene sooner was really where things went from doing that work for me. And so from there, I sought out opportunities so that I could do more work in early intervention and really do specifically trauma work with kids. And so now I am at the Center for Child and Family Traumatic Stress at the Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. And I do a number of different things there. One of the things that I am really passionate about that I do there is that I provide training in parent-child interaction therapy. And so that's a treatment model that helps parents change how they interact with kids and has been shown to actually be pretty effective in helping reduce maltreatment. So that's something that, is a great way to provide some early intervention and to help kind of change the course for some families where there is a chance that those kids could have potentially experienced trauma, or for kids who have experienced trauma to be able to change those relationships and get that sense of safety and support that they need so that they can move forward and not have the traumatic events in their life throw them off course in that way that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, so you're right in the throngs of it, working with these families as they move through some of these really difficult experiences. I love that you mentioned parent-child interaction therapy, or PCIT. I think I also agree that that's an incredible model. And actually, in one of the blogs we wrote for our partnership with Zulily a few months ago, we wrote about the importance of play during the pandemic. And so that was some of the pointers we were trying to give was how the PCIT model in particular talks about child-directed play. So yeah, there's a lot of great tips and resources in there. So you've been doing this work for a while. What has the last year been like? How has it looked different, working with these families and kids?
Well, I mean, obviously we're working through telehealth or having all of my therapy sessions through Zoom. So there are certainly challenges that come with that. And of course, you also have all of the stressors that families have experienced. So the families who come in to see us are typically families that have been self-referred and that are specifically seeking treatment to address traumatic events that they've experienced. And so these are families where there's already been some sort of traumatic event in the child's life. And then we're now working with them in this time where there are these significant stressors going on. The pandemic has been stressful for families in so many different ways, not having access to education, parents having to stay at home, parents who have to go to work despite the fears and the stress related to being in a pandemic. And then beyond that, you have like the anti-racism uprisings that are driven by racial trauma and police brutality. And then even more recently, you have all of the issues related to the political landscape and the events that surrounded that. So when you take all of those stressors together, it has had a significant impact on families and has really led to some more open discussions, I think, with lots of the families that we see about the impact of racial trauma or about, talking about political issues or, what families got from school that maybe we didn't realize before kids weren't going to school, right? So there are all of these different stressors that have significantly impacted family systems that were already pretty overwhelmed.
Yeah, so it's just made it such a part of the conversation, maybe because of what's happening in our social and political context, that may not have been so much at the forefront before, or probably was always there, but just not discussed or thought about, as an issue to bring up in therapy. That's really
Yeah,
interesting.
I think we have always tried, or at least personally, that's always been something that's important to me to make sure that I'm asking questions related to race and related to racial trauma. And I think that there are definitely there has been much more of this awareness sort of across providers in kind of doing that work and making sure that as these events are happening, that there is a safe space in therapy to be able to talk about the impact of these events. And that if that's not happening early on in treatment, then that safe space isn't necessarily going to be there.
Yeah. All right, so we've both been using this word trauma a lot, so I want to just
Mhm.
back up for a second and, ask you, how do you sort of define it, or how, what is a trauma? People, we use that term, we throw it around all the time now. I'm so traumatized by this or that, but I think when you and I are talking about it, we mean it in a pretty different context. And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about, what your understanding is of trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I was thinking about that specifically, the way that we kind of throw that term around. But when we define trauma, and certainly for clinical purposes, we're really thinking about an actual or perceived threat. And a threat of danger. That threat of danger can be with a child. When we're thinking about child trauma, it can be something that's a threat of danger to them or to somebody that they care about. And what happens with trauma is that it overwhelms a person's usual ability to cope, right? So you have this threat of danger, and then, often you'll hear people talk about that sort of fight, flight, or freeze mode that happens. And that's what happens, that coping ability is overwhelmed. And then from there, everyday functioning ends up being impacted when we think about the real impact of trauma that it can have in a clinical sense.
Okay. So fight, flight, freeze. Talk about that. And what does that look like in the kids and families that you see?
Sure. So when we have that overwhelmed system, right? Our system kind of goes into a mode, and that mode can be one of three different things. So you might fight. That might be your tendency is if there's a scary situation, you perceive danger, you're going to try and fight back. For other people, there might be a scary situation and their tendency is to freeze up. For other people, it might be to get out of that situation as fast as possible. And for different people, different types of those dangers are going to cause different reactions. And that's sort of that idea that our system, our usual coping ability is kind of overwhelmed. And so we go into one of these sort of immediate response styles that, doesn't always allow us to cope in the ways that we would want.
So if you think about a lot of the parent and child dynamics that you see, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm just thinking examples could be really helpful for
Sure.
parents. And so what does maybe a fight or a flight or a freeze example look like for a parent, and how might that actually look different in a child? Like, what does a child's fight look like potentially versus the parent's fight response? And so maybe just some examples there would be helpful.
Yeah, so I think like when I think about, I'm just trying to think of some parents, and I think like so when I think about a kid being triggered, and when I say triggered, I mean they've had something that reminds them of a traumatic event, right? And that can be anything, and they might not even be able to name that trigger, but something triggers them, and then that might be cause for them to actually physically fight, whether they're fighting their parent or their sibling or another kid in school, that they're actually getting into that kind of physical altercation. And that can be an example of that fight where you look at it and it seems like, oh, what is up with this kid's behavior? When really this kid's been traumatized and they're having a traumatic response to that. For parents, I think you can sometimes see parents who have experienced trauma or whose child has experienced trauma, and they might be reacting in the same way. They might also be becoming physically aggressive, or they may be fighting in lots of different ways. So, we certainly see parents kind of going into that fight mode by engaging in a lot of yelling at other people, maybe not even with the kid, or being traumatized and potentially having that shut down response. And I think a lot of times with parents, especially parents who have experienced multiple traumatic events and then have their kids experience trauma as well, when they've worked really hard to try and create safety and create different experiences for their children, they can't always protect them from trauma. We can't predict traumatic events that are going to happen. And so I think there's often that tendency to become more numb or to freeze up in some of those situations, that then a child who's experienced trauma is kind of feeling like, my parent doesn't even care. Like they don't even notice that I'm having this response.
Yeah.
And so you see these sort of patterns of interactions that develop that a parent cares deeply and wants to do so much to help their child, and is so, again, their coping ability is overwhelmed by the trauma that they've experienced.
Yeah, those are great examples. Thank you. Is the pandemic a trauma? Like, let's talk about what's been happening in the last year. Is that traumatic for us? What do you think about that?
So I think that's a hard question. And I think that really, when I think about the definition of trauma as I use it clinically, I would say that, in some ways, there have been these perceived dangers where a child might really feel like, I'm going to get sick, I'm going to die, the people who I care about are going to get sick and die. And I think that that's really dependent on what their exposure has been, right? So I think typically, when you think about a pandemic, you would define it more as stress, right? Stress is the kind of change where it causes a strain, whether that's physical or emotional. Stress creates a strain, and traumatic experiences are always stressful. Stressful experiences aren't always traumatic, right? And so for lots of people, and in who are living through this pandemic, the pandemic's stressful, right? It affects your ability to be able to do the things that you normally want to do. It affects your ability to see the people you want to see. So that could be causing some emotional strain, those kinds of things. And so your kids are at home with you, you can't go to work, things that typically created some balance in your life have disappeared. And so there is a significant strain that is caused. And typically, like more clinically, we would think about that as a stressor, right? And I think for families who have experienced loss or had someone in their family get really sick, if there has been a significant amount of exposure to whether it's news media or other types of just information where kids have been more aware of the dangers related to the pandemic, I think that if they really developed a significant fear, that something was going to cause harm to themselves or to their families, then potentially we could consider that to be traumatic.
At Pandemic Parenting, we're committed to sharing our expertise and research in ways that are immediately accessible and useful to families. As part of our efforts to sustain and expand this work, Amanda and I are also available for virtual speaking engagements at your business, organization, PTO, and more. We want to help you and those you work with, grow with, and raise your children with have the chance to do so in an environment that fosters and supports your mental health. Some of the topics we speak on include parenting during the pandemic, the impact of trauma on children and families, children's development, the mental health impact of COVID-19 on employees, and more. If you or your organization are interested in potentially collaborating with us, please reach out for availability and pricing through the Request a Speaker form on our website at www.pandemic-parent.org/contact.
So, I've been thinking about it a lot as this notion of what's called a collective trauma, right? So a trauma that, is impacting an entire group or a society in our case, sort of global society. And I think that one of the interesting things in conversations I've been having is that people who might not have understood much about trauma before, or, just encountered people who've had some of these adverse early childhood experiences, they're much better able to understand, like, oh, this is what it's like when, all of my resources are taken away and I can't access my village, and, all these transitions and disruptions, like you said. So I've been thinking about it a lot in that way, but, people's experiences are so different. So for some people, like the domino effect of the stressor, as you talked about the pandemic being a stressor, the domino effect of that can actually lead to some of these more chronic, ongoing issues for people that could be traumatic.
Absolutely. I think especially for communities of color, and when you look at the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on those families, and then you combine that, especially for Black and African American families, with the racial trauma of the past year, it's definitely an indication of complex trauma. And then sort of what you're talking about kind of makes me think about historical trauma. And like ultimately, there may be a point when we look back and say this was absolutely globally a historical traumatic event. And again, we would have to think about the disproportionate impact on certain communities.
Yeah. Yeah. Or these intergenerational pieces. Like I've seen some of these, jokes go around, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, about how, when people have gone through other historical traumas, World War II, various, types of issues like that. And they'll talk about, oh, well, my grandparents do this sort of strange thing, or I never really understood this. And I saw a lot of people joke about that in the beginning, well, our grandkids, like, I don't know why my, grandfather always hoards toilet paper or has this need to, and it's sort of like, but I actually do wonder, what will be those things that have started to get woven into the fabric of our DNA that are going to be passed down, that our kids are starting to understand life a little bit differently, that in a few years, nobody will ever think about, so these things, like we saw the changes in airports after 9/11, and now we don't even think twice about needing to take our shoes off and not being able to bring liquids. And so it'll be really interesting to see, like, what are those intergenerational things, though, that'll get passed down?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. You're so right. Like thinking about the response to September 11th and those changes. And even for us who lived through that change, right? It's sort of like, oh yeah, that's right. That did happen after that huge traumatic event that some of us lived through, right? So it's really, it's interesting to also see how, I think that kind of calls attention to how resilient people are, right? That like, especially when there's something like a situation that so many people are impacted by in such a broad way that, there is at times the ability to sort of come together and have that resilience to be able to sort of, okay, so these coping mechanisms have changed, or how I handled this might have changed, and I'm still able to cope.
Yeah.
Right. And it's when it doesn't feel like we can cope anymore that's when it becomes like that impact of trauma. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great segue into just sort of thinking about both stress, trauma, and resilience. So in the way you've described it, I'm sort of understanding it as maybe there being this continuum of stress. And so there's, normal everyday stressors on one end, and then on the other end is this really, extreme, absolutely devastating traumatic events in people's lives. So we've gotten a lot of questions from parents around like, how will I know if my kids are traumatized by this past year? So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that continuum and how parents can tell the difference between, okay, these are some stressors for my kids, but they're sort of manageable and here's how they're weathering it, versus like, no, wow, my child is really impacted by this.
Right. So I think that it's hard because when there are so many things changing at once, which is what this past year has been like for parents and their kids, it's really hard to know like what is the cause of this, right? And so I think that's a big part of it, is trying to figure out like, where is my kid at developmentally, and what was my kid's temperament before, right? Really thinking about what was my kid like in terms of handling situations that were challenging prior to this. And I think for parents with toddlers or really young kids, that's really hard because it's like they're
Yeah.
changing so quickly. It's hard to know, is this a result of something else? And so I think trying to really pay attention to, are there significant and consistent changes in your child's mood and behavior? And would you say that those have really been notable since either the onset of the pandemic, or if there was something that was particularly challenging for your child during the pandemic, like that stands out as them not going back to school, or they went back to school and then their school shut down again? Things like that that maybe stand out as events that might be particularly difficult for your child to deal with. If you're noticing those significant and consistent changes in mood and behavior that really seem like there was a clear onset or something that happened, then that's really when we'd be thinking, okay,
Mm-hmm.
this is significant and we probably need to get some outside help, right?
Yeah.
Well, as psychologists, there's a whole manual, right, that we use to be able to say, okay, this is something that's significant, right? This is something we're going to consider a diagnosis and be able to or choose to then provide some treatment around.
Mm-hmm.
And that manual includes a whole section related to trauma and stressor related disorders, right? It's not just like there's just one diagnosis. And I think a lot of times people think trauma, they think post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that must be what it is, right? And so, yeah, there's a very specific set of criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are other diagnoses in there. We
Mm-hmm.
have acute stress disorder, we have adjustment disorders that are all capturing the challenges with stress and with changes for children, and how they are then having these more significant functional impairments, right? And
Yeah.
that's like one of those clinical terms that I use there. But when you think about functional impairments, it's really thinking like, is my child having difficulties regularly,
Yeah.
right? Are we seeing these difficulties? Kind of, most people are mostly at home right now. Are we seeing these different difficulties in different experiences at home,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where even when we're trying to do something fun together, they're really struggling,
Yeah.
like
Things they
trying to
used
have
to
those.
enjoy. Right.
Exactly. And seeing that change. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really consistent with the study that I did, and a number, now I'm seeing results from a number of other colleagues, similar studies, right? And just sort of seeing some of that decline in the study I did, which is about 450 or so families. Like in just the first 3 months, we saw pretty concerning changes in kids' emotional and behavioral functioning. And so
Mm-hmm.
we had about like just under 1 in 4 kids showing really concerning downward trends, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
lots more emotional and behavioral problems as rated by their parents. And so what I think is really interesting about what you're saying too is that, they might not have met criteria for, like you said, post-traumatic stress disorder, or we might not clinically say, quote unquote, those kids were traumatized,
Right.
but they were showing a lot of challenges and a lot of concerning trends. And so I think that's a really important message for parents, that you're saying that it might not be about, whether they are traumatized. It might be more though that I'm really seeing my child have more aggression and fighting and
Mm-hmm.
tantrums. In my study, we found that younger kids started to show more of those externalizing symptoms.
Yep.
Or it might be that in your older kids, which is what we found in our study, that older kids were becoming more depressed, withdrawn, maybe having suicidal thinking. And so there are many ways this can show up in our kids, not just in the traditional sense of, are they traumatized, or what that would look like. So what can we do about that? Like, I have 3 little kids. I'm trying to figure out for each of them what they need. I mean, the other thing I was thinking as you were talking about, have you noticed changes, especially as being a big indicator, is we've been at this for over a year now. And so in some ways, I'm not sure I can even remember what they were like before. I mean, obviously I remember that, but just like, was this an issue before? It's now been an issue for so long, or so much of the last year, that it's really hard for me to have that clear insight into whether this is a change over time. So, yeah.
And I think that sort of, so, the change piece is really in terms of being able to determine, is this trauma or stressor related, right? That's separate than like, is my child having a significant emotional or behavioral concern that may not be stressor related, right? Or that is still driven by the stressor and is ultimately more of a mood or behavioral issue that's outside of trauma or stress specifically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like an indirect effect. So it's not the pandemic specifically, but that it's, they haven't been able to do any of their sports or recreational activities. And so because of that, I'm seeing this increase in aggression or fighting because they don't have that outlet. Is that kind of what you mean? Like,
or impulsivity, or, inattention, or any of those things, right?
Yeah.
So absolutely. So I think that it's important to recognize that, like, generally what we're thinking about is like, if we're thinking more broadly outside of trauma and stress, right, then we're always thinking about what's going on with our kids and how can we best support them. And in that case, like, if there are consistent challenges that they're having related to mood or behavioral concerns, then, and we're seeing those again, sort of even in activities that they used to enjoy, across different experiences, right? Even though our experiences are more limited now, really seeing that they are having those significant symptoms, then we would want to do something about that, right? We want to talk to somebody and get some help. And that wouldn't really matter if it was like, oh, this is at the onset of the pandemic and I'm certain that that's been the cause, or, any other reason, right? When our kids are having significant challenges, we want to be able to do something and get them some support, right? And there are kids who are, families that are managing the stressors of the pandemic, right? And sure, there are obviously going to be changes and increased challenges that the kids are having that aren't as consistent or concerning, or at the level that we would say, this is really impairing them on a day-to-day in day-to-day experiences. Like, I can see that every day my kid is really impacted by this, right? And so if there are things like that where, you're trying to just create an environment to support your kid as much as possible despite the stressors going on, the key that I often talk to parents about is that, as much as possible, regardless of the stressors, trying to be as consistent and predictable as possible. Now, that's really hard when, in general, right? That's always really hard. And that's that much harder when everybody has been stuck in the house for a year.
Yeah. And we don't know what's going to happen week to week, month to month, right? There's all this uncertainty. And I mean, I feel that on a huge level. It's like, I intuitively knew, like, let's keep as much routine as possible and let's keep this predictability. But it's like, I don't even know on a day-to-day basis what's happening with their school or their Zoom sessions or my work or so. Yeah, it is just like trying wherever you can to have that sense of routine and sense of consistency. And one thing I was thinking about as you were saying that is, that might look different for each of your different kids. That was something I needed to just keep reminding myself all throughout the last year, is to not be trying to just make blanket decisions for the children, like recognizing each of them has different needs. They're managing this differently. It's showing up in their behavior or emotional functioning in different ways. And so how to try to be sort of attuned and meet each of them where they are, because their
Right.
needs might be different. So that even that
Yeah.
consistency you're describing actually might look different for each of your
Yeah.
kids.
And I mean, especially like thinking about your kids, right? You have an 11-year-old and a 4-year-old. Like those are really different
Totally
ages.
different,
You have
right?
one in the middle too, but
Yeah.
just thinking about those specifically, like those are such different
Yep.
ages, and developmentally they're in such different places that their needs are entirely different. And so absolutely, I think that's such an important point, that based on where they are developmentally, based on what you're seeing in terms of like what's working for them, that consistency and predictability can be different for each kid for sure.
And that's been hard. I just want to sort of say this to other parents, like that's exhausting, right? It's hard to sort of
Mhm.
track each of them in line with your own mental health and needs yourself as you're dealing with all of this loss and uncertainty too. And so it's just a lot to kind of keep tracking each person.
That
So
last
yeah,
thing sorry, I don't
no,
mean
go
to cut
ahead,
you off, but
please.
like that last piece of what you just said, which is like keeping track of your own mental health, like parents, you can't care for your kids if you're not caring for yourself. And I think that with the way that I think, especially mothers in particular, the expectations are so high, and the expectations during the pandemic in particular have been so, so high on moms.
Mhm.
And it's so hard to prioritize that self care. And especially for kids who have experienced trauma or are having this ongoing stress, like without your own ability to care for yourself, like it's going to be that much harder for them, right? Because if we're not taking care of ourselves, then like our own ability to regulate our emotions is going to be way off. And then those reactions, those responses to situations that feel like they shouldn't be a big deal to a kid are then going to feel like a big deal. And for a kid who's experienced trauma, and even for kids who are having this ongoing stress and these ongoing changes, that unpredictability that already exists in the world, then having that increased at home because their parent is so overwhelmed, is
Mhm.
just going to make things so much worse. So I think it's so hard for parents to be able to remind themselves, like, I need to take this time to take care of myself. And it's essential.
Yeah.
It's also modeling, right? So if a parent is able to take that time and to be able to say, like, I need a minute, I need to take a deep breath, I need to do something to take care of myself, like that's actually modeling for kids coping strategies. And
Mhm.
in doing that, then kids are learning, oh, okay, this is a way for me to be able to handle something, right?
Yeah.
They're seeing that in action. And the way that most kids learn the most, especially in early childhood, is through that modeling.
hmm Yeah. No, it is so important. And at the same time, it's been one of those sort of frustrating things throughout the pandemic for me. And I know so many of the parents we've been talking with is like, I know, self-care, all that stuff. When,
Right.
how, you tell me what. And
Right.
so I just like, for me, that's just had to show up in different ways. And it's interesting. I was just reading an article a couple days ago with a term I'd never heard before, which was something like, I might get it wrong, but revenge bedtime procrastination. And it was talking about how people have been staying up really late in the
Mm,
pandemic, and you're just like, you're doing nothing productive.
right.
Um, and I was realizing like, yeah, I was like, I feel so attacked by this article. This is exactly what I've been doing. But that weirdly was my self-care. I mean, and interestingly,
Mm,
the point of the article was just how detrimental that can be to your sleep hygiene and those kinds of things. But for me, this is literally the half hour a day I get when everybody's finally in bed. I can just do what I want. Nobody needs anything from me. There's no emotional meltdowns I need to manage. And I can just have some time to myself. And so that was
right.
always a cost benefit, right? Of I know I'm going to be tired because I stayed up way later than I should, but that weirdly was the self-care I needed. And that was
Right.
the trade-off. And so I think it's just important to emphasize that taking care of yourself can look really different
Oh,
right now.
absolutely.
And so we've written a couple blogs about this idea of just, it might be the best self-care you do is to say no to something or,
Right.
advocate for what you need. So you're exactly right that we really can't take care of our kids in effective ways if we're not taking care of ourselves.
Right.
Um, so related to that, the pandemic isn't the only trauma people experience, of course, and it's not going to be the last thing that, we
Right.
experience that's really hard or our kids might experience. So I want to talk just sort of generally about this idea of, what trauma-informed parenting is and just what can parents do? Let's start with just prevention. Like, what can I do as a parent to prevent trauma for my kids, if anything?
So, that's the thing. Like, it would be great to be able to say, you can prevent trauma. You're going to keep your kids safe, right? And
Yeah,
that's
put them in that
most,
bubble. It's going to be just
right.
fine.
Yeah,
Right.
that's most parents' goal, is to keep their kids safe. So, like, can you prevent trauma? Sure. You can't personally, like, you can decide, I'm not going to maltreat my child, right?
Right.
And so that's a great choice. Like, absolutely. So you can potentially prevent that trauma happening in the home. And like, we can't look at a person and know that they're going to maltreat our child. We can't predict a natural disaster or the sudden loss of somebody that we care about, or a serious accident, right? If we could predict those things, we'd live in a totally different world and
Right.
it wouldn't be real.
Right.
So, you know, we can't ultimately prevent trauma from happening, right? Because these are not things that we predict or plan for. We can do everything possible to keep our kids safe, and there are still going to be things that can happen, right? We can feel like, I really trust this person, and then that person may end up, causing harm to our child. Hopefully those things don't happen, and sometimes they do. And so, recognizing, I think parents want so much to be able to keep their kids safe. And so there is so much guilt that comes with a child experiencing trauma, that parents experience. And really, one of the things that I do with parents in those situations is really help them understand that, like, it is not their fault that this happened, that they
Mhm.
can't predict these experiences, that they have done everything possible to keep their kids safe. Um, and so I think that that's really important for parents to realize, that, like, as much as we want to do everything possible to keep our kids safe, there are things that are out of our control, right? And that's one of the things
Yeah.
about becoming a parent, is that, like,
Yes.
everything is suddenly out of your control. And so
Yeah.
there's also just this level of acceptance that kind of has to come with that, of, there are going to be these things that I can't control, and how can I create safety and consistency in ways that feel good for me and for my family.
Hmm. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I've always loved that characterization of, when you have a child, a part of your heart starts living outside of your body. And it's like you really can't put this bubble around that piece of your heart out there.
Right.
But we can do things to try to help them. I want to go back to when you were talking about resiliency, to be
Hmm.
more resilient and to navigate their way through these really difficult things, better than in other cases. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Like, what can we do when our kids are going to go through lots of difficult things in their
Hmm.
lives? What are some ways as parents we can support them through that?
So I think one of the most important things is to understand the impact of trauma, and recognizing that when a child's experienced a traumatic event, they don't, everything has felt like they've lost control, right? And like, things are now suddenly so unpredictable. And so recognizing that, like, your child's behavior and emotional responses are most likely driven by those traumatic events. And so I think for parents, there's this tendency to want to manage that. And I think recognizing that if there are ways that you can show some acceptance and be able to validate some of that, the pain that your child's experiencing, the behavioral responses that they're experiencing, that can make a big difference.
Mm,
Um, and so the only way that I think parents are able to do that is if they really do understand that impact of trauma,
mhm,
and of stress on their child. And so part of that, what helps with that, is knowing sort of the signs and symptoms of trauma and of trauma related disorders. And so if your child has been through a traumatic event, being able to then get some support so that you have that understanding, because you shouldn't be expected to, like, learn all of that on your own. right?
Yeah.
That's why there are people out there like me who do this work, and like you
Mhm.
who do this work, and lots of people who, are really committed to providing interventions related to trauma. And one of the most important parts of most of those interventions, especially sort of the gold standard treatments for trauma, is that there's some psychoeducation provided, that
Mhm.
families learn about trauma, that they learn about trauma symptoms, that they understand the impact of trauma, and that they start to be able to make those connections between certain behavioral responses or certain emotional responses and how those are related to the traumatic events that the child's experienced.
Yeah.
So those are some ways.
Mhm.
um, and then I think there's a tendency for parents to want to really know everything, right? And like they want to sort of have their kid talk about it. And I think in general, right, there's this tendency that when all adults are interacting with kids to just ask tons of questions, right? And that's actually like not super helpful for our kids because you know, kids have this amazing ability to express themselves and to be creative. And the more we are kind of guiding those conversations or taking control of those, the harder it is for them to do some of that expression on their own.
Mhm.
And so I think giving kids space and, I think parents, when they think a traumatic event has occurred or they know that a traumatic event has occurred, there's this desire to like ask a million questions and find out like what happened because they're anxious and upset that something terrible could have happened to their child. Of course, that response makes sense. And it's not necessarily the most effective response for your
Mm.
kid.
Yeah.
So trying to avoid that pressure on your child, trying to avoid the kind of repetitive questions, and really, when they are willing to share, when they are opening up, creating a space that allows, them to talk and you to really listen.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's really important. And then I think, one of the things that we've talked about already is just when we see that there is a significant impact on their functioning, knowing that we can ask for help and trying to
Mhm.
obtain some help and support so that then we can learn more, like as parents, about the impact of trauma and the signs and symptoms of trauma, like I mentioned earlier, so that we can
Mhm.
do more of that validating and do more of that modeling of using skills.
Yeah, I think I have so many thoughts in response to all of that. I think the reminders, especially about, right, just not firing questions at your kids. And I mean, I've been there, so I'm not saying that from any place of judgment. Like you're so
Right.
worried, you want all the
Of
information, I need to
course.
know what's
Yeah.
going on, right? But it just makes me think about, sometimes when we do that, obviously that is more about, as you were saying, kind of assuaging our own
Right.
anxiety about this, guilt about this. Like I need to know more information. I need to know exactly what happened.
Right.
And it makes me think about, my youngest tells me often, will say, of course, right as he's supposed to be going to bed, but mom, I need to tell you a question. And that's always how he says it. I have to tell you a question. And it's always sort of stayed with me the way he words that, which, a lot of young kids word it that way before they
Mhm.
kind of understand how to phrase that sentence. But
Right.
it's just a good reminder about when I am asking my kids some of these questions in these difficult situations, it's in many cases more about me telling them a question, right? It's like
Mhm.
whatever my fear is or my worry coming through in that question that I'm
Right.
trying to convey to them, then rather than, as you were saying, actually listening and really
Right.
letting them control and drive that, which I think comes more from, as you were saying, kind of creating the time and space for those conversations to come up when they are comfortable. If
Mhm.
that's just, I'm laying next to them in bed at night and we're just kind of hanging out, not really talking about much, that organically, then that's when they'll bring it up, but
Right.
not when I'm, all right, I need to ask you about everything that happened, because then
Mhm.
I'm telling them questions, which is really probably more about me than them.
Right. Yeah, and I think, you mentioned like the that need to ask questions when where it comes from, right? And that there is that anxiety. And I think the other piece of that is like, again, it kind of goes back to that modeling, right? Being able to model the ability to manage stress and to cope with change. And I think when there are traumatic events in particular, parents are incredibly upset and hurt by that, right?
Hmm.
And I think that those are super valid feelings. And I think figuring out ways to kind of manage those effectively, especially depending on how your kid is responding, right? So there are situations where it makes the most sense to do some, like, if a family has experienced a shared traumatic event, right, then it totally makes sense for a parent to have an emotional response to that and to be able to exhibit that response in a way that, you know, the child can understand and see. And at the same time, what often happens is that parents are having these really big emotional responses that make sense based on the situation, and kids are being exposed to these big
Mm,
emotional responses, and they don't necessarily fit the kid's response.
yeah.
Or a parent is upset because the kid's response doesn't match their own,
Hmm.
right? And so I think just the awareness that people respond to situations differently, that kids respond to situations differently than adults do, and that different situations can result in those different coping responses, whether they're adaptive or not so adaptive.
Yeah.
And so being able to really, as much as possible, if the parent is in a position where they can get to a place where they can manage their emotional response and have some of that emotional regulation, because again, that's modeling that it's okay to get upset, it's okay to have these emotions, and we can manage them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think there's even like simple examples of that too, where we're just processing it differently or on different timelines, as you said. Like I talked with a lot of parents, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, around, well, I'm so upset that my, daughter's not going to get to have her senior prom, but she doesn't seem phased at all. And so it would be sort of that parent coming back, but I'm so upset and I keep telling her how sad I am for her about this. And it was like, well,
Mhm.
wait a minute, if she's actually
Right.
managing it okay, like you should have those feelings. You're entitled to them and you should be able to process them, but don't do that with her because you don't want to
Right.
put on her this grief that you're feeling that she's maybe not in the same way, or
Absolutely.
vice versa. So from your perspective, what does trauma-informed parenting look like? Like what's really important about that?
I would go back to, like, really trying to create that safe space. And a lot of that safety, especially after a kid has had significant stress or a traumatic event, they feel like things are so unpredictable. And so that consistency and predictability, which means, acceptance of where they're at, right? And so some of that validation, being able to engage in play and things like that, having those positive experiences with a parent, and also clearing consistent limits, which I think a lot of times when a traumatic event has occurred, there is this tendency to think, well, I'm just going to let my kid do whatever. And that actually makes a kid feel less safe and makes
Mm,
things feel less predictable. So I think that consistency and predictability, with that understanding that there needs to be, those positive interactions, that there needs to be that acceptance, and that there also need to be, some limits and some consistency around safety. And
mhm,
then I think, I mentioned before, having parents understand the impact of trauma, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, and responding in ways that support their child without causing further re-traumatization. So that can mean creating ways to help them feel safe. And again, that can be through consistency and predictability. That may be through actually creating some, like, safety steps in certain areas, depending on the traumatic event. And then recognizing the impact of the child's trauma on your own self-care as a parent,
mhm.
going back to having the parent be able to regulate their own emotions, and having the parent be practicing and modeling those self-care and those emotional regulation strategies for their
Mhm.
kid.
Yeah, those are great tips. Thank you. So, my last question for you is if you could give parents one piece of advice right now, what would that be?
Take care of yourselves. I know
Hmm.
it's the hardest thing to do. And again, it's really about, like, if you are taking care of yourselves, then you're in a better place to be able to take care of your kids. You can be modeling those things that I was talking about. You have more of a capacity to, even if it's for a short time, engage in those positive interactions with them, right? If you're not taking care of yourself, then it's going to be, okay, we got to get through the day. We got to get through this and this and this and this. And there's no time for enjoyment or engagement, right? It's just one thing to the next. And for lots of families, that's how it's been for a long time, pre-pandemic or not, right?
Yep.
And like being able to kind of have this space and have that time is going to be a lot easier if you're taking care of yourself.
Thank you. And thank you so much for talking with us today and sharing all this great wisdom.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Always a joy to see you.
Oh, you too.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. Make sure to hit follow or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you're listening on to be notified of future episodes. We'd also love to connect with you on social media. Look for our blue and yellow logo when you search Pandemic Parenting on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube, and you'll find us. Or follow the links in the show notes.
Let us know what you think of this episode by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Your 5-star review helps us move up the charts to reach even more parents and caregivers. If you have a specific question or topic you'd like us to address in a future episode, let us know. You can email info@pandemic-parent.org and mention podcast in the subject line.
And this podcast isn't all we do, by the way. Pandemic Parenting is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free science-based resources for parents and all who care for children while navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more about our organization and access our extensive library of webinars, videos, blogs, and more, visit www.pandemic-parent.org.
Lastly, this show wouldn't be possible without supporters like you. Lindsay and I donate our time to this podcast, but we do have an incredible team working behind the scenes to make this all happen. If you'd like to support the show beyond leaving your 5-star review, visit www.pandemic-parent.org/support and donate today.
Thanks for listening. Hope you can join us next time.